When you think about youth crime, your mind probably jumps to the most dramatic, most frightening stories you see on the news. And those lurid headlines can really shape our entire perception of what's happening out there. But how much of that is the whole story? How do we separate the fact from the fear? Well, let's take a look at the data. So let's take a story from 2015. There was this huge investigation into two rival street gangs in the Bronx. They were called Two Fly and BMB. And it uncovered this years-long war of shootings, stabbings, and robberies. Their victims included a 15-year-old who was stabbed to death, several other teenagers who were murdered, and even a 92-year-old woman, Sadie Mitchell, who was killed by a stray bullet while she was in her own home. It is an absolutely terrifying picture of youth violence. Stories like that are undeniably real, and they're tragic. But they can also kind of skew our perception if they're the only thing we see. So the real question is, how do we get past the headlines to the hard data? How do researchers actually measure the true nature and extent of delinquency in a way that's reliable and, scientific? To get a really clear and accurate picture, experts don't just rely on one source of information. Instead, they use three primary tools. You can think of them as three different lenses, all looking at the same problem, but from slightly different angles.
Okay, so first up, you've got the official police records, the brass tacks of who's actually getting arrested. Then, you have these big nationwide surveys of crime victims, which give us a sense of what people are actually experiencing. And finally, and this one's really interesting, you have anonymous self-report surveys, where young people tell us, in their own words, what they've been up to. Each one gives us a really crucial piece of the puzzle.
Let's start with the big one, the Uniform Crime Report, or the UCR. This is the FBI's massive data collection effort. Every year, thousands upon thousands of police departments send in their data on crimes that were reported to them. They track arrests for really serious stuff like murder and robbery. They call those Part I crimes, and also less serious, Part II crimes like vandalism. But here's the thing, and it's a huge thing. The UCR has a massive blind spot. Researchers call it the dark figure of crime. Get this, less than half of all violent crimes are ever even reported to the police. So if the cops never hear about it, it can't possibly end up in the UCR, no matter how serious it was. So to try and get a peek into that dark figure, researchers use our second lens, self-report surveys. Famous studies like Monitoring the Future ask thousands of high schoolers anonymous questions like, hey, how many times in the last year did you steal something worth more than $50? This helps uncover all that law-breaking that never ever leads to an arrest. Now look, this method isn't perfect, right? You have to trust that kids are being honest. And these surveys often completely miss the most serious chronic offenders, the ones who might already be locked up or have dropped out of school. But what they show, time and time again, is that delinquent behavior is way, way more common than the official arrest stats would ever have us believe. Okay, so we've got these different ways of measuring crime, each with its own strengths and weaknesses. But when you put them all together and you look at the trends over time, a really surprising picture starts to emerge. One that pretty much flies in the face of the whole crime is out of control narrative. And honestly, the data is just striking. Take a look at this chart. Despite what you might think, the juvenile arrest rate isn't going up. After it peaked way back in the mid-1990s, it's been in a free fall for decades. The number of kids arrested in 2015 was a full 50% lower than it was just a decade earlier in 2005. I mean, that is a massive, significant decline. And here's why researchers are so confident this is a real trend. It's not just one data source telling us this. The UCR arrest data, the victim surveys, and the self-report surveys, they all show a similar downward trend. And when all your different measurement tools point in the exact same direction, you can be pretty darn sure the decline is real. But, okay, knowing that crime is down overall, that's just the first step. To really understand what's going on, we have to dig a little deeper into the data and look for patterns. Researchers call these correlates, basically social and personal characteristics that are strongly connected to delinquent behavior. So what patterns pop out? Well, for one, gender plays a huge role. Males get arrested about 3 times as often as females. Social class is another major factor. Kids from the poorest backgrounds tend to face the greatest risks, but the strongest correlate of all, it's age. Crime is overwhelmingly a young person's game. For most people, delinquent behavior hits its peak in the late teens and then just drops off a cliff. It's called the aging out process. As people mature, get jobs, start families, and just develop a better sense of long-term consequences, the appeal of doing risky, illegal stuff, it just kind of fades away.
Now, we have to talk about one of the most persistent and, frankly, troubling patterns in all this data, the racial disparity in arrests. Minority youth, particularly African Americans, are arrested at a much higher rate. Researchers generally explain this in two main ways. One view points to what's called institutional racism, biases within the justice system itself, things like racial profiling or getting harsher sentences for the same crime. The other view points to structural racism, so broader societal inequalities like underfunded schools or a lack of economic opportunity in certain communities that create conditions where crime is just more likely to happen.
So we know that most kids age out of crime, but that raises a really critical question, doesn't it? What about the ones who don't? What about that small group of offenders who start early, commit serious crimes, and just keep going?
Well, that exact question led to what is honestly one of the most important discoveries in this entire field. A researcher named Marvin Wolfgang and his team did this landmark study. They followed nearly 10,000 boys born in Philadelphia all the way from birth to age 18. They tracked every single interaction these boys had with the police to see what patterns would emerge. And what they found was, well, it was stunning. A tiny fraction of the boys were responsible for a shockingly disproportionate amount of all the crime. How small a fraction? Just 6%. Think about that. This tiny group, the chronic 6%, was responsible for over half of all the delinquent acts committed by the entire group of 10,000 boys. And when you look at the really serious violent crimes, their impact is even more staggering. They committed 71% of the homicides and a whopping 82% of the robberies.
So who are these kids? Well, research shows they share a pretty distinct set of characteristics. They start committing crimes at a very young age. That's called early onset. They're persistent, they're often violent, and, this is critical, punishment just doesn't seem to stop them. They are the ones who are least likely to age out of crime and the most likely to become career adult criminals.
So this really is the crucial point, right here. While the headlines might make it seem like youth crime is this widespread, random plague, the data tells a much, much more specific story. A very small, identifiable group of chronic offenders is responsible for the lion's share of the most serious and violent crime.
And that discovery, it just leaves us with this huge, really challenging question. If we know that a tiny percentage of offenders are causing the vast majority of the harm, does that change how we should think about everything from prevention and intervention to punishment? Where should we be focusing our time, our money, and our attention to make the biggest possible difference?